Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry for the late uh, lecture. I've been having, and I hope this works because I've been having recording issues in this room. But anyway, it is what it is. Um, Today, I'm just going to talk with you about the assignment that's due this week. Analyze an autoethnography lessons from Lowell's The Gangsta, the Prisoner, and the Immigrant. I'm going to call him Alberto because he's my friend. It just feels really weird to refer to him as his last name. But basically, this week, what I want you to focus on is, just kind of getting deeper into autoethnography as a genre. Um, you'll notice that the word count is a little higher than usual this week, but we're still in that we're still practicing. I think the main thing for this week that I want you to kind of focus on is really thinking about things like paragraph breaks. I've mentioned this to quite a few of you who are turning in work that doesn't have any paragraph breaks consistently each week, that you want to start playing around with it. When you choose not to use a paragraph break, it's not wrong. I want everybody to kind of think about form as something that we're really exploring in this class. I think autoethnography for me is an important genre because it is interdisciplinary. It allows you to, and you're all already doing this, it allows you to uh, kind of explore different media, different mediums for expression and to kind of bring them all together. So, whenever you see an autoethnography, you're probably going to be looking at something that has pictures. You're going to be looking at, something that probably makes, possibly incorporates other kinds of writing. So not just, something that we take to be like the academic essay form, which that in itself is problematic as a genre, um, but autoethnographies, bring in poetry and lyrics. They use speeches, they use letter writing, they use all different kinds of form. Maps come in a lot. We've done a mind map this week. So when you're looking at an autoethnography, you're always looking at something that's kind of like interdisciplinary. So this week, we're going to look at the gangster, the prisoner, and the immigrant. First and foremost, because it's just a really, really good example of an autoethnography. It brings together an individual's experiences with a lot of systems in place, right? The outside world, the institutions that Berto is a part of. So, he talks quite a bit in this essay about prison, about the kind of the carceral system, about law enforcement as a system, and immigration, and the way that all of these things are kind of bound up with each other. Um, Gang culture comes in, and gangs as a system, that operates both in and outside of the prison space. So so it's just a really, it's a really, really good autoethnography, and I want you to read it. I want to expose you to it in the way that, I asked you to watch that really long documentary with Zora Neale Hurston, where you're not only are you looking at the kind of giants of ethnographic research like Zora Neale Hurston, who's pretty much like, you call her the mother of autoethnography, I think. But to expose you and also giants like Bell Hooks, but also to just expose you to just really good examples of undergraduates who have done autoethnography in the past. Berto didn't know he was doing an autoethnography when he did an autoethnography. So I think the term is irrelevant. It's more the purpose and grasping the concept of really autoethnography's center, which is the relationship between the self and the world, and kind of seeing the ways in which the individual is forged in and through these systems that they often, that they may or may not have any control over. So, exploring that kind of role of choice, that's something that comes into the gangster, the prisoner, and the immigrant actually quite a bit. So, uh, what I've asked you to do is kind of, read the essay that we published on Lucid's website. So this is the version of the essay that was originally written for a course. This is Berto's website. You can read about him here. So if you go to his writings, we'll look at his artworks in a minute, but if you go to hit the writings on his website, all of these are from various courses that he took while he was at UCLA. I really appreciate that he put these up on his website in their original form with the MLA formatting so that, you, the students, can kind of look at something like this and think, oh, wow, what does it mean when we take an essay that we wrote for a class and we, treat it, as Berto has done here, as an artwork, right? So he gets a whole other tab here on his website with writings, but instead of just putting, these are my thoughts, like when someone would do if they were doing a blog, he chooses to keep these in the form that they were originally written. Partly, he told me because he wants to pay tribute to the teachers who brought him the material that and the prompts that made it possible for him to engage in this kind of writing, which I thought was quite nice. But also because um, he felt that displaying it this way was a way for us to kind of think through power dynamics, and how students can take the things that are given to them in a class by a teacher and transform them and use those things to empower themselves. And so, another reason for putting these up isn't just a kind of act of paying tribute. He said, these were good teachers, but, that wasn't the primary reason. The primary reason was the way in which it also empowered him in his own life. So I think that's just something for us to kind of keep in mind as we're moving back and forth between these two published versions of Berto's essay. One is that you have this essay that's created in the classroom space, that's presented as something that comes out of the classroom space and out of the learning environment. And because it is presented that way, so think about form, right? Form is something that we will continue to think about in the class, we'll continue to practice in the class. But if you think about this in terms of form, the form that this essay takes also presents us with how to experience the what is meaningful about the essay. So because we see this little thing preserved here, we experience this essay in a completely different way from the way we experience it when our first image is not, the position of author as student, right? Author as a person who is in a course where they are following instructions, but instead we see the author kind of front and center here, right? And there is no evidence, and we really thought about this when we were publishing and designing this essay for Lucid. There's no evidence here that of the markers of a classroom environment except for this one, which is, on the first sentence of the essay. On the first day of this course, Survey of Critical Thought, I was not too sure what the course was about. And, this course leads you to believe that it's happening at that moment, but it could also just be, referring to this one time, right? This one course. So we're really kind of outside of the terrain of the classroom environment now, especially because this is the first image that we see, and we're inside of an artist's studio. We're not even sure that, who this person is. All we really see is a kind of imposing looking figure, somebody who talks a lot about his observable identities. We have this imposing looking figure, and behind him are, images of these kind of artfully arranged shanks on the wall. And you've got, a bunch of tattoo art in the background. So, and I believe these are documents that he displayed from some of the administrative aspects of prison life. So very, very different kind of presentation of the material. And therefore, right, we have a very different experience automatically just based on the design, based on the form of what it is we're going to, where we're going to be next when we start reading through this essay. So as you're kind of beginning to take notes and think about which one of these, which two, I want you to choose two or three questions to compose your answer. So as you're kind of collecting terms and you're thinking about uh, what the essay means, um, I want you to kind of have those two things in mind. Is that the well, actually it's one thing you're going to have in mind, right? And that is the question of form that hovers over all of this stuff. Not just the two forms of the essay, but also the way in which Berto is exploring as an artist his own kind of form, right? His the identity, the various identities that he has been, given, right, that he didn't ask for, and the ones that he chooses. So so I'm going to kind of I'm going to go through the questions with you, and then I'm going to kind of say a few things at the end. And then I'll, let you decide which questions that you want to choose to write about. I would, for something like 750 words, I would try to just choose one and extrapolate as much as you can from that. That's just good practice for those of you who are really struggling with generalization. I know quite a few students have come to rely on the ChatGPT function for organizing. So, my job has now become trying to show you why ChatGPT organization is actually determining the content of what you're doing, right? It's not simply organizing the things that you've made. It's in its organization, it's determining what gets made and how we experience what gets made. So you're really making very few choices, even if you've convinced yourself that you've written the whole thing and you're just putting it through ChatGPT to organize it for you. It's still it's still going to spit out a kind of general kind of essay. So, the first thing that, if you really want to get good practice in for this one, instead of choosing a bunch of, your three questions and possibly saying something somewhat, general about each one, you can kind of use this as an opportunity to really dig in with one question and see how much you can pull from it, right? So the first question is, how does this essay function as an autoethnography? And then I've given you some ideas, right? Consider the autoethnography's title. So the gangster, the prisoner, and the immigrant makes you think this is going to be an essay about a gangster, a prisoner, and the immigrant, maybe three different ones. We don't yet know if they're the same person. You can tell from this image that they're probably the same person, right? Because it's one person, and then you get all of the words here under his arm span. So, right, you get these kind of visual clues in design, which you're going to be doing later, that tell you really, and you might not even know it, right? But it's telling you what it's about. So you can focus on something like that, right? If you wanted to write about that, if you wanted to answer that question, how does this function as an autoethnography, instead of the kind of stale, this essay functions as an autoethnography because blah, 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 right? You could start by saying, we can see that this is an autoethnography even in the title, right? Because on the one hand, we see an individual, and on the other hand, we see embedded in these titles various systems. Systems involving gang violence, systems involving imprisonment, systems involving immigration, and presumably, right, these three things are going to kind of overlap, and we're going to find out how they all express themselves in this one person. So that's autoethnographic, right? So you could say a lot there. You could actually write 750 words, about the image that is at the front of the essay, and just the title alone, right? So think about that. if I were to ask you to do that, it might drive you nuts. But if you wanted to do it, you have the opportunity now to do so, right? Because you've got this, you've got this option. So you can think about the uh, cultures that are present. He talks about Chicano culture in Los Angeles. He talks about growing up in Santa Barbara. The other day we were talking about somebody telling him he was a Chicano artist one time, and he wasn't sure what that meant, right? What does that mean? And we were just talking about dealing with labels, right? Labels can help, but they can also harm you. They can pigeonhole you, they can limit your opportunities. And so, in adopting labels, we have to be very careful because they can be empowering, but they can also take all your power away. So, thinking about things like these kind of labels, these contexts, these cultures, these movements, and all of these things that kind of, we pull out of, we don't even know where, right? That's what I think, pop culture is really all about, right? We pull all of these things from social media, from the world, from just the conversations that we have or hear or are around in our communities, depending on where we live. And all of that is, the context. All of that is our field site, right? All of that is the context. So playing around with just kind of like autoethnography as kind of a concept for um, bringing together the relationship between the individual sense and the context in which that individual sense evolves. That's really what you're doing when you're exploring the question of autoethnography. And then the final thing here is once you've done that, identify how the author's experience reflects the context you describe. So really what I'm asking you to do um, is to make sure that you should be doing this whenever you're reading about somebody else's experiences, right? I see this a lot in writing these days. Because I do a lot of personal writing, students will write beautifully about their own experiences because those are the things we tend to think about the most. And then when it comes time to thinking about somebody else's experience, suddenly we feel uncertain. We don't want to say the wrong thing. Uh, we may feel that we may feel that we've sort of rushed through that part. And, the takeaway was really how we identified with the experiences that we saw. So I see myself in this author, therefore I can't see the things in this author that aren't like me. And I don't really want to engage with those things because I don't want to get them wrong, right? I think that defines a lot of what I'm seeing students do when they're turning in work that's about other people, right? They're either uh, uncomfortable with exploring identities that aren't their own, or they're uncomfortable with, writing about those things, even though they're not uncomfortable to explore them. And I think, sometimes it's both and. uh, so uh, So I think that the really important thing is not to avoid difference ever, right? That's something that you can get even when you read the bell hooks, just the annotations that I saw alone really explore this idea of how we can meaningfully engage with our differences without creating conflict that is unnecessary because we fear difference and therefore we tend to avoid it, right? Just because you're afraid of something or makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean that you should avoid it, right? And getting to know somebody else and the ways in which they are different from you is always a good thing, unless that person is just like a violent person. But even then, even then. Okay, so second question, how does art for Berto interact with and redeem the three identities that he carries with him? So we're going to take a look at that art. Okay, so the second question is asking you about the artwork. Um, So just to kind of, uh, uh, get to the heart of the essay, Berto says, uh, let's get to the end, right? He says, actually, you know what? Let's read this. I'm a 41-year-old undergraduate art major at UCLA. My life in higher learning began late into my 30s. When I was 36 years old, I paroled from a California prison after serving a sentence of 14 years. It was while incarcerated that I realized I was an artist. So that's the first identity that we're really seeing him declare, right? The other things were things that happened or conditions of his existence, but this is an identity. I realized I was an artist. And it's kind of an interesting term to use, right? He discovered to realize you're something is to discover something about yourself, right? It's not simply to create that thing about yourself. Spending countless hours locked in a box forces an individual to make use of the time to not go crazy, which is how some prisoners end up. I believe that if you are able to deal with the stresses of the confinement in a positive way, an individual could walk away from all those years with a positive attitude and maybe even knowledge and wisdom gained from the experience. So I want everybody to kind of avoid some of these tendencies that I see in essays where, the conclusion is, and, now everything is great because I realized all these things. And when we do that, we kind of we resolve tension that actually makes it easy for our reader to kind of forget about the important things that we want our reader to, we call this like the call to action, right? I'm sure some of you have heard of this. You want the reader in an autoethnography that's especially got a socio-political message to kind of feel responsible in some way. And, so you always want to identify, okay, what is the narrative at work here? In what way is this person kind of giving a story that has a beginning, middle, and end? In what way is the kind of conclusion to that story in tension with other aspects of that story? So, right here, you see Berto kind of declare even up front, right? We're not even at the end yet, but this essay does also end on a positive note with him getting into prison education activism with underground scholars. Um, and I'll say a little bit about that later. Uh, but just because he kind of concludes this about himself doesn't mean that we get to walk away from the conflicts that exist and that are created by systemic injustice in this essay. So you always want to kind of think about how, as a writer, your goal is to maintain to some extent the tension in your narratives where you've got an individual in relation to the world, right? Because that is a tense relationship, and if not always, at least sometimes. Um, about 4 years into my sentence, I began to look for ways that would take me out of the prison space on a mental level. I noticed that a lot of inmates would exercise on the yard, so I began doing that, and it does help. But what really took me out of the prison space was drawing. It was art that made the prison walls disappear, even if only for the hours I would work. It was this habit of simple pencil drawing that led to art books and then a passion for art in general. This passion led to other forms of knowledge, such as philosophy and eventually college correspondence courses. I began to realize that my way out of the prison I was physically in, but also the mental prison I had placed myself in before prison, could only be overcome if I started inward deep in my soul. My entire artistic practice is based on three identities I discovered about myself while incarcerated: the child of illegal immigrants. And notice, right, he uses illegal immigrants as a phrase here, not because he's adopting that phrase himself, but because he's using the phrase that was put upon him by a culture that sees undocumented people as illegal, right? So, and that impacted his identity. It impacted his sense of the way that he viewed his parents, but also his sense of himself, right? I'm the child of this label that you have put onto my family members, and that has impacted not only the way that I see them, but also the way that I see me. The gang member, so another identity, right? That, as we talked about, by the way, we're publishing another article with Berto in the upcoming issue of Lucid, which is going to be an interview I just did the interview. So the interview is really fresh on my mind. One of the things that we talked about was like, the what are the options, right? If you're the child of illegal immigrants and you're growing up in a neighborhood that is heavily infested with gang violence, and gang activity, that's your other option, right? Your other option besides going the route that his parents did, which he describes as, the kind of um, the undocumented route of constant hard work for very little in return, right? So then there's the terrible lie and promise of gang life that you will get rich quick, right? So he talks about that in the essay as well. And then his other identity that he discovered about the three identities he discovered about himself was the identity of the prisoner. And the prison space is something that he explores extensively in his art. So when you go to his website and you look at his artworks, which I encourage everybody to do, go beyond just the essay that we published and look at his artworks, you'll see a lot of his art comes out of his exploration of his identity in the prison space, the identity of the prisoner. And so the exploration of kind of like, what it felt like to be confined for all of those years. And then he's got a lot of these other things about the observable identity. So I encourage everybody to look at and kind of explore all of his artwork. It's really fun to go through. Um, so when you think about his uh, various identities, right, he gives you the identity of the gangsta, the prisoner, the immigrant. And out of these three identities that he discovered about himself while he was confined, he says he discovers two other identities. And I want everybody to notice how he inverted these sentences from the gangster, the prisoner, the immigrant in his bio, right? Choose to create a new identity while incarcerated, the artist. And here it's, I choose a new identity while incarcerated, the student. And, I think in some ways it's safe to say that artist and student for him are interchangeable terms, and that he's always kind of doing art as a way to learn about himself and the world that he lives in. So if you get into this one, right, how does art for Berto interact with and redeem the three identities that he carries with him? Right. I would say that, the best way to deal with that is to kind of just look at the art, have some fun with, the kind of many different mixed media and different art forms that he explores. This one's really great. This is my mom and uncle's green cards. And you can see these are all kind of like, this is what's called found, art made with found materials. So just like whatever you have laying around. You can look at this art. And remember, he talks about his dad. The only English my dad spoke was, I don't speak any English, no speak English. And then you can see, right, he's got all of these things where he refers to his art and then he talks about what it means to him. So when we publish Lucid, we oftentimes will ask contributors for an artist statement, and that's kind of what these are, right? It's like kind of sometimes someone will do a bio statement about why they're an artist, but other times they'll do an artist statement about the piece and how the piece came about, the context in which it unfolded, the biography of the piece itself. So not simply my biography, but this thing has a biography. Right. And so you can write about that yourself if you choose number two, you might choose one of these pieces and then the kind of, statement that exists next to it, the little paragraph or couple paragraphs where he talks about these pieces. This one is from a series called Investigation that this is really my personal favorite of all of the art that he makes, which is where he uses fingerprint powder from, fingerprint powder, right? It's like, I know it from TV. Berto knows it from people breaking into his house, from police breaking into his house and using it to try to like identify him as a thief when he was 12 years old. So very different, relationships to fingerprint powder. But one of the things that he does with his art is he uses fingerprint powder on various mediums, and then because fingerprint powder, picks up on the leftover, not just our fingerprints, but like our body stuff that we leave behind. So he will um, roll around on the fingerprint powder. He'll do various things where he makes art out of that, and he talks about this too. And then you've got this one, and next to all of this art too, in the original publication, he put quotations from Edward Said, who's a very famous Palestinian American intellectual, uh, who the teacher of the course that Berto was in when he wrote The Gangster, the Prisoner, and the Immigrant, asked them to read a lot of Edward Said and to use Said's essay that he had assigned for that course to kind of construct this personal account of experience that Berto gives us in his own essay. So Edward Said is kind of like this sort of uh, further kind of context for the essay. And in each one of these artworks, you'll see a kind of, quotation from Edward Said that Berto chose to go with that piece of art. So if you are going to do, any of the artwork, and feel free to go beyond the gangster, the prisoner, and the immigrant. I mean, I think this is just the easiest one to write about because you've got all of this material with it, where he talks about the art, right? So this one, he talks about the art. He talks about the passage by Said that is with the art. So if you've never written about art or you've never written about film, and all you've done is kind of written college essays about things that you've read, think of, anything that you read is a text. The world is a text, right? It's not just the writing. So, if you're not sure about how to approach it, how do I write about that? You can just start like you would with any text, right? I will be analyzing, you know, um, the artwork titled Alien, with all these others. You can call it Alien Inmate, but I'll be looking at the title Alien Inmate. I'll be looking at the artwork Alien Inmate, and then you can kind of, just like you would with anything else, introduce what Alien Inmate is. It's mixed media on paper, but you can say, Alien Inmate appears in The Gangsta, the Prisoner, the Immigrant. It's one of Bertolucci's artworks. And it is kind of comprised of his prison identification card and his father's identification card, and he uses a variety of different strategies to explore the intersecting relationship between those two things, right? These cards that we carry for our identity, and how do we end up there, and how did we get there, and what does it mean to us, and what does it tell us about the way in which Berto is thinking through the problems of his own identity while he is creating this artwork, right? Well, he's a student of his own life in the context of building a piece of art. So I think that that's a good way to kind of think about what you've been doing in this class, right? Autoethnography is like, it gives you this opportunity to be kind of like a student of your own life, and you're building a kind of project that explores some of the complex features of your identity, and of your identities, I should say, because we all have many, many identities. We have multiple identities that make us up. And of course, they all intersect, but we might want to focus on a couple of, or even one. So if you do that one, right, you can get into the identities. You can get into the art, and that's always fun, especially if you want to go over here and you want to look at more artworks. There's more art here too. These are called prison ready-mades. He has a whole essay about this in his writings that I've taught before that he also talks about in the essay, talks about prison ready-mades and Gangsta the Prisoner and the Immigrant. These are very, very interesting kind of art form where he talks about, Marcel Duchamp's found the sculpture is called Fountain, but it's actually a men's urinal, and he put it in the middle of the Louvre, and then, it was like this became this thing called a ready-made, where you take the object's function out of its context, and then it becomes art, right? So he does something like that here. The difference being that, ready-mades are actually kind of mass-produced objects like the urinal, and this is a homemade object. So he's actually asking us to kind of even take our ideas of, how we label things in the world, how we label things in the kind of uh, uh, outside of the prison space, we'll say for now, how we label things, and then how, those things kind of exist in the prison space. So in the prison space, these things are kind of like mass-produced things, right? A shank is a mass-produced thing. A lighter made out of a pencil and a couple of wires is a mass-produced thing, right? Many, many people create it and use it in that space, but it's also a homemade thing. So kind of, getting into questions about like, the way in which, um, the prison space contains the the uh, people who have now been relegated to outsider status are now inside this space kind of being creative. And so that's where you get this idea of like prison art as outsider art, uh, which is a particular art form. So you can kind of see, uh, there's more anyway, there's more art, there's more art. These are good. These are the prison stencils. These are prison dittos. And again, same thing. He talks about the art, and he talks about, he has the Edward Said quote. And so there's a lot to be said about the art. This is his master's thesis, if you want to take a look at that. And it's got more discussions of the artwork. And this is artwork from his exhibit, his master's exhibit. So who is Edward Said and why does Berto identify with him? What does this identification have to do with the art that Berto produces? So I've already said who Edward Said is, and Berto identifies with him because Edward Said is a Palestinian American. He's living in exile, which means that his parents immigrated to the US because they had to leave Palestine, and they raised Edward Said in the United States. And so he is a kind of, just like Berto and his parents, kind of, who, his parents are exiles from Mexico, and Edward Said's parents were exiles from Palestine. And so there's this kind of like outsider identity that comes even from being an immigrant, let alone an undocumented immigrant, that that Berto is exploring through Edward Said's writing. What does this identification have to do with the art that Berto produces? I think that that's something that, when you look at a quotation, like we go back to something like this, right? This is a quote from Said. Necessarily, then I speak of exile not as a privilege, but as an alternative to the mass institutions that dominate modern life. So if the mass institutions that dominate modern life, right, the schools, the political sphere, even the medical, right, institutions that dominate modern life, then exile as a kind of concept, as a way of being, as a way of living in the world, is an alternative. Exile is not, after all, a matter of choice. You're born into it or it happens to you. But provided that the exile refuses to sit on the sidelines nursing a wound, there are things to be learned. He or she must cultivate scrupulous, not indulgent or sulky subjectivity. So in other words, you know, being in exile is not something you want. It's something that happens to you as a result, usually of um, conditions that are driving you into a state of exile, or you've been driven to a state of exile, and you don't have any choice. But you do have some choices, and those choices are to get into who you are, right? Cultivate scrupulous subjectivity. In other words, right, you because you're in these conditions and you don't have any choice, you have to figure out who you are, and that's going to help you maintain power over who you become. So when you're thinking about, the art that is produced, that art, remember I said he's a student and an artist, right? As he's creating that art, he is engaged in the act of cultivating scrupulous subjectivity. So I would say that, that's really the kind of what you're getting into when you're thinking about the art that he produces. The art that he produces is the cultivation of the subjectivity that comes out of exile. So the Said stuff is, for those of you who really want to challenge yourself with a kind of deep analysis of, Berto in conversation with this famous Palestinian American activist, then I would say go for question number 3, right? It's the smallest question, insofar as it's only 2 questions, but, 2 short questions, but it's probably the most complex exploration that's on this list. And then the comparing and the contrasting of the 2 published versions of the essay, I've already really gone through that with you. Where you can kind of just take those 2 side by side. You could talk about the interchangeability of student and artist that I already covered. But you could also just talk about, the role of, you know, the 2 different, right, versions of this essay's presentation in its kind of public form, right? You've got one that really centers the author of the essay, that really highlights not only the author of the essay, but also kind of puts, our the undergraduate who's working with us, who took the photographs, um, was really was somebody who admired Berto. And you can see by the way that he took the photograph that Berto is coming across here as a very, very strong, authoritative kind of presence. And so, when you compare something like that to something like this, where the context is in deference to the learning environment in which the essay was produced, where you get um, MLA formatted, old school, you know, and all of them are like that, right? I don't know if I already said that, but all of these writings are going to be, in the form of the course in which they were taught. And Berto told me that the reason why he did that is because, first he wanted to honor the teachers that made it possible for him to produce this work, right? Because of the prompts and the lessons and readings that were assigned, he had an opportunity to engage in this kind of reflective writing and this descriptive writing that he wouldn't have had before. So in part it was to, pay homage. And on the other hand, it was to empower himself. And so when you're kind of thinking about doing a compare contrast between these 2, you've got, just you can opt for just like the 2 versions of the author that we get, the 2 impressions that we get, right? This one might be student and this one might be artist. And then you can kind of explore the interchangeability of those 2 things. Okay. And so just so that I don't, go on and on and on. And remember, you're going to choose, you can choose 3 of these and give shorter answers, or you can choose one and do a kind of extended analysis. If you know what you want to say and you know what you want to explore, if you're like, I just want to explore the art, then you can choose number 2, and that will be fine. But, choose the one that you actually feel like is going to teach you, right? So if I were to say, what's in it for me if I choose 3 of these, I would say, okay, well, maybe I want to explore a really short account of one of these questions, right? I might actually want to try to respond to this in 4 or 5 sentences. Uh, maybe I want to see if I can say something valuable in 4 or 5 sentences that doesn't confuse my reader, but is still somehow insightful. And then I would want to do, 500 words for maybe this one. Maybe I've got 150 over here, and then I'd want to do, I want to divvy it up. So I want to try to answer this in 200 words, right? So it's really, really, really good practice if you look at a question and you assess what it's asking you and you think, how many words does that feel like it would be? Do I actually think I can respond to that meaningfully in 150 words if the question is so complex? Right? This is how does this essay function as an autoethnography could be answered in a very simple way, or it could be answered in a complicated way. This is where you have to ask yourself, what's in it for you, right? What are you trying to do here? I'm your teacher, but you already know that I don't give a damn about satisfying, checking off boxes. I'm actually trying to teach you something. So the goal for you should be, if other students are reading this, how am I going to make this interesting enough for them? What am I going to say that is actually of any value? So really kind of think about that, right? If I've got 750 words, I've got 5 questions, I can choose one, I can choose two, I can choose three, I can decide how to divvy them up in any way I want. How am I going to make those choices? Well, how you're going to make those choices is that you're going to ask yourself what you want to learn, what you want to practice right now, right? What would you like to focus on? Would you like to focus on the extended analysis? Would you like to focus on the kind of practice with form, where you're trying a variety of different types of things, in which case I would go with 3, or you want to do a little bit of both, in which case I would try 2, right? If one doesn't work, then maybe the other one will. But always choose the one that, kind of stands out to you the most and that gives you the most opportunity to both dig into your strengths, but also learn a little bit as well. And then 5, this piece ends with a vision of community. There are more prisons in California than there are Cal States and UCs combined, Lowell writes. I would like to see that reversed in my lifetime. After reading this essay, what do you think Lowell's vision of community might look like in an education setting? So this is kind of the hardest question insofar as, if the Edward Said's asking you to get into kind of a complex thinker, this one's really asking you the autoethnographic question, which is, how does this apply, right? If we're thinking about this person's account of things, uh, what does this vision of community that he has look like in an education setting? So let's take a look at the very end of this essay. I should introduce you to, this is Pedro. He took our photographs. He's also got something in the upcoming issue as well. So we'll just read well, I'll say a little bit about how I met Berto. Um, so I met Berto a couple of years ago when I was coordinating with the underground scholars at UCI. Underground scholars are a UC-wide program that is designed to help formerly incarcerated people acclimate to higher education. A lot of people that come through underground scholars are transfer students like Berto, but underground scholars also helps system impacted students. So that would be, undergraduate students who have not been incarcerated themselves, but who have had a family member who's incarcerated. They underground scholars, and at the Cal States, it's called Project Rebound, will help these students, succeed in the higher education setting. So I met Berto because I was coordinating with underground scholars to do to have a bunch of pieces published in Lucid by system impacted and formerly incarcerated students at UCI, and that's how we met. Um, so uh, uh, So I'm going to go ahead and read. So now you know what Underground Scholars is. So I belong to a student organization here at UCLA called Underground Scholars, a group of formerly incarcerated students. And I should say, Berto had transferred to UCI for his master's degree. So even though he's referencing UCLA, that was his undergraduate degree. When I say I met him at UCI through their Underground Scholars program, it's because he was in a master's program there. Underground Scholars, a group of formerly incarcerated students who focus on helping and supporting each other as well as those still behind the walls with the same message that education is a key to freedom. Education is the practice of freedom is the name of the course, right? Obviously, we're not a big organization, but we're here and they've gotten much bigger. And we're not afraid to admit and share our lives in the hopes that society will stop the mass incarceration of minorities. There are more prisons in California than there are Cal States and UCs combined. I would like to see that reversed in my lifetime. And then, the final paragraph is this quote from Said: borders and barriers which enclose us within the safety of familiar territory can also become prisons and are often defended without reason or necessity. Exiles cross borders, break barriers of thought and experience. And he says, this passage gives me the most hope. I think of the proposals by the current White House administration under Trump to build a wall, but I also think of the fact that it has not been built yet since this 2000, I think it's 19, has not been built yet. I think of my entire life being a series of borders, bars, cages, boxes, and how I was able to somehow not let them trap me. I become hopeful that others will do the same and not let themselves be trapped or enclosed by a false sense of security by people who have monetary interest in mind by building new walls for us to live within. And there's a subtle suggestion there that, right, just because you're out of the prison space doesn't mean that new walls aren't being built. And I think that today we can kind of understand that because of surveillance. We've all experienced kind of the discomfort of surveillance, uh, both in the education setting and beyond, so it's not just in prison that you feel surveilled, that you might feel that your body is being controlled or determined to do certain things that you feel like, you didn't really have a choice in. And then he says, I think of the distance I created from my parents who came here for a better life and the divisions created within my own people by a system who at times seems to want division more than unity, and remain hopeful that by sharing these experiences of being exiled in my own land, I can help and bring people together. So, the possibilities that open up because of the things that have happened to us, right? That's really something that I want you to focus on if you decide to answer that last question. Right? What would his vision of community look like in an education setting? So if it is a practice of freedom, if we are acting as a community, and this is where, if you really want to answer this one, you could go back to your bell hooks response and you could look at the things that you said. You could even look at the annotations as a kind of quasi-digital community space, right? And think about, what does it look like when we begin to think from the perspective of the well-being of everyone, of the community? How would that begin to change what we do in an education setting, right? If we don't have that now, what would we do? How would that change in an education setting? But you can also just kind of do whatever. If you want to answer this one, if you have something in mind that you would like to explore about that vision of community, maybe it's a negative, maybe that's something that, right, you don't think can come true in an education setting. So you could take his vision of community and try to apply it to the current education setting and kind of think about the ways that what kinds of things we would have to change in order to make a community setting, right? That kind of vision of community that Berto talks about in his essay for formerly incarcerated students to get their education. And also, I think just kind of generally, like using that question to explore the distinction between something like learning, like the identity of the student, right? Inhabiting that on the one hand, and the education environments, the institutionalization of our education on the other hand, and how those things are in conflict and tension in some ways, and in other ways, right? The institutional space kind of facilitates our learning and our ability to really fully realize ourselves as students. So, if you just want to kind of use that to explore that, you might choose option number 5. So just to kind of, oh, just to kind of recap, um, if you want to choose, well, wait, before I recap, if you want to choose number 5, that's kind of more reflecting on not so much Lul's essay as just education and the environment in general. So kind of, you know, you could choose something where you're talking specifically about his art and then maybe looking kind of reflecting as a whole. That might be an option for choosing the 2 questions. So just to kind of recap, sorry, I'm getting a phone call I have to answer. So just to kind of recap, I went through all of the questions for the homework, gave you options for kind of thinking through answering each one of those, talked a little bit about, organization and form, and just really trying to get you to kind of continue to keep an open mind as you work through these various assignments each week, and you're exposed to different forms of expression and education. That you're just going to continue writing, you're going to continue practicing, you're going to continue, reading as much as you possibly can. I've given you options too if you can't, if you have a short attention span like I do and you're finding it really difficult to get through a full text like this, you have options for looking at art, for kind of dissecting just like images and titles. You don't have to fully read something cover to cover in order to write about and think about it, but you do have to be exposed to it. And so, another option is like this video. You can watch this and you can get a pretty good sense of what Berto's writing about, what he's thinking about, and the art that he's producing. So I hope this helps. Good luck. Let me know if you need anything, and have a good week.